How does the Christian chaplain help people experiencing grief, loss, and bereavement? In Christian theology, we understand that death and dying exist because we live in a fallen world and every person has a fallen nature. Therefore, it should not surprise us that every person, including us, faces pain and suffering and hardship. Chaplains help people navigate these treacherous waters. The question is not, will suffering, hardship, pain, and death happen? The question is, what will we do when it does happen? Alistair Begg suggested, and I quote, "One of the great challenges for a Christian believer in our day is not simply to be able to show our increasingly godless environment what it is to be a joyful person, but to be able to teach our society how to grieve. Chaplains ought to be better at joy and better at grieving than anybody else in the universe." Many chaplains, even some of you, need to go deeper in your heart to experience emotions that you might be avoiding. Far too often we fail to properly handle joy and crying. As a result, we never really experience either emotion to the full measure that God would have for each of us. As Christians, our hope is found in the saving grace we received from Christ. And if that doesn't give you joy, then either you don't understand the gospel or you don't believe it. Even so, in sorrow, pain, and loss comes grieving for everybody. Just because we are Christian doesn't mean that lamenting is to have no place in our lives. A full 1/3 of the Psalms are laments. There's an entire book of lament called Lamentations. The purpose of lamenting is to remember God, turn to Him, and trust Him for the end result while continuing to move forward, knowing that He is good. All Christian lamenting is for the purpose of leading us to God. And we chaplains are literally keepers of the sacred presence. So we must become capable of leading ourselves to Him through the art of lamenting before we will ever be able to help someone else do the same. And that is a primary purpose of chaplains who provide spiritual care to those who are grieving. Does this mean that we should be quick to break down and weep at the slightest inconvenience? Someone cuts in front of you in traffic, or another person says some offensive comment to you, or you face a heavy workload, or you don't get that thing you want, or that circumstance you prayed for. Then you collapse like an empty burlap bag, grumbling about the trouble? Well, I believe to cry is human, but to lament, now that is Christian. There's a difference between grumbling and lamenting. In Philippians chapter 2, Paul says, "Do all things without grumbling." We see the Israelites constantly grumbling in the wilderness and being rebuked for it, even punished for it. But where do we see God punishing those who are lamenting? We don't. So what's the difference then? The difference is important for us as chaplains, and it is your posture. If you have an arrogant heart that responds as if you are in charge, that you can know good from bad apart from God, then you're not coming to Him to cry out to Him or to express your pain and your confusion. No, you're coming as a judge. You're telling God that He's governing the universe all wrong. Grumbling pushes you away from God. Grumbling is produced by one who believes they're the masters of their own personal kingdom. But the truth is, we can never truly pray, "Your kingdom come," unless we let our kingdoms go. The lament is different from the grumble. Lamenting acknowledges pain. It expresses confusion. It even can ask questions of God, but ultimately it drives you closer to Him in the midst of your pain and confusion. It gives you strength to continue and to persevere. As we've taught several times so far, chaplains must be at peace to bring peace, and must be calm to bring calm. Do you know how to lament, or are you practicing the art of the grumble? This is an important thing for you to reflect on if you're to effectively help those who are experiencing grief, pain, hardship, and loss. Most of the time, we associate grief with the loss of a friend or a loved one who died. But grief really is a stress reaction that can be and often is caused by any kind of loss or even fear of a loss. There are many situations that cause people to experience the symptoms of grief. Some of you are experiencing these symptoms right now as I speak. Death, of course, is a source of grief. It's the most obvious cause. But a loss of health or loss of friendship, loss of job or possessions, essentially a loss of any kind can trigger grief. The symptoms of grief are highly subjective from person to person. Grief is a reaction to stress that a person will have in response to real, anticipated, or even a perceived loss. If you learn to recognize grief and how to deal with it in your own life, you will be far better equipped to help someone else through theirs. And we often hear the word bereavement. It's used in connection with grief. In a clinical setting, bereavement typically is applied to a person experiencing the emotions caused by the death of a loved one. So when one refers to the bereaved, they're actually talking about the survivor. Most clinical settings treat bereavement within that understanding. Grief and bereavement are similar terms that can be easily confused. When teaching our chaplains, I suggest that bereavement should be thought of as the objective state of a loss. It is the actual experience one goes through when they have a loss. It's the reality of loss, not necessarily limited to death, though that is the context in which the word is typically used in clinical settings. Bereavement refers to the objective state or reality of a loss. The definition provided by encyclopedia.com is, bereavement is used to describe the objective situation of someone who has experienced deprivation through the loss of a person or thing that was valued. Although bereavement is a factual situation of loss, how individuals respond to loss can be highly varied. It is an actual experience one goes through when they have a loss. And any loss that may trigger symptoms of grief could be categorized as bereavement. Though clinical settings typically associate bereavement only to death, we argue for a more expansive understanding of the term. The bereaved is one who has experienced any kind of loss. But grief is different than that. Grief describes the subjective response a person experiences from a loss. It is the emotional response to a loss. Grief is the aftermath of bereavement. It's a subjective, emotional stress response. It's highly variable from one person to another, though its symptoms can be defined. But the symptoms don't appear in any particular order for anybody that is experiencing grief, hence the phrase subjective response. And so bereavement is the objective, actual experience of loss. Grief describes the subjective, emotional response in the aftermath of bereavement. And to complicate matters, grief can also be triggered by a loss that hasn't even actually happened. Consider some examples of specific kinds of grief. Normal grief is simply that subjective emotional response to a loss, either real or perceived. Grief is part of life. It's normal. Everybody experiences grief. It isn't unusual for the subjective emotional symptoms of grief to last for 6 months to a year. Anticipatory grief, well, that's the response of grief that a person experiences when they anticipate a loss, even though it hasn't actually happened. Grief can be caused by an imagined loss that isn't real. A loved one has an illness that they might not survive, or a drop in the economy creates an environment where loss of employment becomes a possibility, or a major storm is heading your way and you anticipate loss of life and or property. How about a global pandemic brings fear to continue living your life? Will there be a food shortage? Can I afford to put gas in my tank? Any of these can produce anticipatory grief, even though an actual loss hasn't been experienced. Well, what about disenfranchised grief? That's when a person grieves a situation, but their cultural context or family, society itself, doesn't give them permission to grieve. In other words, it is not socially sanctioned, and so They try to repress their grief and hold it in so that a disapproving family or culture doesn't rebuke them. For some, loss of an animal companion may not be an acceptable reason to grieve. Or a teenager experiences a breakup. An ex-spouse dies. Imagine a happily married woman with 3 children comes home from work to find her husband in bed with another woman. They divorce, and then the husband marries again to the woman he was in bed with. They remain in communication because of the children, and 7 years later the husband dies. And a flood of memories, both good and bad, come pouring back into the ex-wife. Friends and family may say something like, "Good, he finally got what was coming to him." And that creates an environment that makes it difficult for her to grieve. This is disenfranchised grief. The feelings are there, but the person doesn't have permission to express them. The chaplain gives them permission to let the grief out. Complicated grief is something to be careful of. It is normal for people to experience grief, even profound grief from a loss. Helping them grieve well toward a return to normalcy is part of pastoral counseling that we chaplains do, and we can be very effective at it. But grief that lasts 6 months to a year, that's perfectly normal. Grief that lasts longer than a year, though, could be dangerous, and it may be necessary to find a trained professional to help the person deal with it. Every chaplain is involved with some form of pastoral counseling, but psychotherapy is not pastoral counseling, and it is important that we network with professionals who can take over when we get in over our heads, and oh my, you will get in over your head. Complicated grief may be one of those issues where you need to get some help. In the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for the American Psychiatric Association, called DSM-5, a controversial decision was made regarding bereavement. Here, the word was applied to the response of a loss due to death of a loved one. The change was controversial because some professionals believed that it may cause normal grief to be treated now as a mental disorder. In the DSM-4 and prior versions, bereavement was excluded as a potential mental disorder because it was assumed to be a natural response to loss that would heal over time naturally. Many changes have taken place over the years with the academics of the American Psychiatric Association. For the Christian chaplain, some of these changes are problematic, and rightly so from a biblical perspective. Transgenderism, for example, is now, among many professionals, normal, normative, natural, rather than treated as a gender dysphoria as it was described in the past. It's no longer defined as dysphoria, but confusion. A condition that can be treated with hormone therapy and surgery. Likewise, in DSM-5, bereavement may now be treated as a mental disorder. The positions have switched. Transgender is no longer a mental disorder, but bereavement is. Possibly. Yikes. Many in the profession objected to this. The fear we expressed is they want to make normal grief a mental disorder. However, the objective of the change was to allow professionals to acknowledge that grief associated with bereavement from the death of a loved one may lead to complicated issues that should be or could be treated with psychotherapy. By removing the exclusion, they allow for that possibility. And a course of treatment would then be covered by appropriate insurance. Certainly, there is truth in the idea that bereavement leading to complicated grief can produce major depressive disorders, can even lead to suicide. And so it should be taken seriously, and that was the goal of the DSM-5 bereavement exclusion in spite of the confusion it created. As people move through life from childhood to old age, a variety of normal life circumstances will produce the symptoms of grief. A small child may not understand the meaning of death, keeps asking when their loved one will come back. Or a teenager graduating high school is now faced with the loss of all the familiar routines and familiar friends, now headed off to a new future in an uncertain circumstance. Or a parent faces the arrest of one of their children for some crime. A change of jobs produces uncertainty. An adult crosses over that middle age point of life and realizes that most of their life is past them, where the elderly find it physically impossible to do those things that they always used to love to do. These all describe normal life. And even though we have all gone through them or watched others go through them, it's still new to us when it's our turn to experience them. Giving people permission to grieve and helping them do so is part of our jobs as chaplains. A chaplain is one who is willing to listen, to love, and to understand. When a person is in a dark place, unable to see the light, the chaplain is willing to sit with them in the dark. Everybody has Eeyore moments when we need someone to simply be there, not to fix anything, not to do anything in particular, but to just let us feel that we're supported and cared about. And so it will be an important part of your spiritual care to learn how to practice the ministry of presence, to listen, to understand without judgment or condemnation, and simply grieve alongside them. Lamenting is the Christian means of grief, the kind that draws us closer to God, and that is exactly what our job as chaplains are, Christian chaplains. These things help in the healing process. And so, when someone that you encounter is suffering grief for any reason, acknowledge the very real existence of it and simply listen to understand.